Good morning. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this month's Integrative Medicine Lecture Series. I want to welcome all of you to this lecture series. I think we have a treat here today. Our visitor is Dr. Patel, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Psychology at Tufts. Dr. Patel got a bachelor's degree from the University of Virginia, a Ph.D. from Harvard, and was in San Diego for a number of years where he was senior fellow at the Neuroscience Institute. He is also president of the Society for Music Perception and has received awards for music scholarship, including the 2009 Power Award Institute for Music and Neurologic Function in New York. He's really a scholar of the science of music and the brain, with a particular interest in music and language, and that's of great interest to NCCAM as we are interested in the therapeutic potential of music. So I'm delighted to be able to introduce Dr. Patel for this month's lecture.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to thank Dr. Briggs for the invitation to come and speak to you. I'm very excited about this opportunity. My topic today is exploring the impact of music on brain function. And the question that really drives this talk is, what measurable impacts do musical listening and musical training have on brain functions? And I want to focus on effects that are quantifiable, that are replicable, and that are understandable in terms of biological mechanisms, where at least you can formulate alternative hypotheses that can be tested. Now, why is this a good time to ask this question? People have been speculating about music in the mind for millennia. Plato remarked that rhythm and harmony find their way into the inward places of the soul back in 300 or 400 BC. So why ask this question now? Well, one reason is the remarkable development of tools, of neuroscientific tools for examining the brain on multiple spatial and temporal scales. This graph shows spatial and temporal scales on different axes and different techniques for recording the brain at these different spatial and temporal scales. And you can see some familiar characters up here: functional fMRI, PET, MEG, and ERP, and so forth, give us windows onto the brain that we never had before. And one of the things we've learned quickly from these neuroimaging techniques is that music processing is widely distributed in the brain. There is no single music center in the brain. This is a slide that comes from a colleague in Germany, Dr. Stefan Kolsch, and this is an fMRI image showing areas with, that are more strongly activated when a listener, a non-musician, listens to sequences that are more structurally complex versus less structurally complex in terms of harmony. And what you see is not just auditory areas, which would be on the left and right side of the brains here, but frontal areas, temporal areas, parietal areas, and this is just one aspect of music, the harmonic aspect. If I could overlay activations for rhythm, memory, emotion, you'd see wide swaths of the brain activated. So there is no single music center, and this raises the idea that music has the potential to interact with many brain functions that are also distributed in different regions of the cortex, such as language, memory, attention, and so forth. Another reason this is a good time to ask this question about the impact of music on the brain is that there's been a sharp rise in music cognition research in the past decades. This is a graph from my colleague Dan Levitin that he published in Nature, showing the number of scientific papers per decade in the field of music cognition, the basic psychological research on music. It starts in the 30s and marches on up, and this big giant bar here is the 2000s. And you can clearly see the trend here. This is an area where research is growing rapidly, and so the combination of neural techniques and psychological investigation makes this a very good time to ask this question. So I want to divide this issue of the impact of music on brain function into two broad categories. Transient effects, or what you might call music in the moment. T.S. Eliot remarked, you are the music while the music lasts, in one of his 4 quartets, and that's about what happens when the music is on. And then the other part I want to talk about is lasting effects, that is, effects that last weeks, months, or even years, mediated via mechanisms of experience-dependent neuroplasticity. And the focus here is the impact of music training, that is, actively learning a musical instrument, on other cognitive domains. Okay. Now, certainly when we think about the music in the brain, one of the first things that comes to mind intuitively is the role of emotion. The idea that music has strong links to emotion is very old indeed, and it's borne out by a lot of research. And music's power over the emotions really is remarkable. But emotion is not the main focus of this talk. I'll be treating emotion as an enabler of other biological effects. It's a powerful internal reward system that drives other brain systems. But it just merits a little bit of discussion. It's kind of an amazingly remarkable fact that tones, without meaning, without semantic associations, can have such powerful effects on our emotions. Oliver Sacks writes about this in the beginning of his wonderful book, Musicophilia. He said if a Martian came down to Earth and observed us listening to music, he'd be rather puzzled. There's no semantic messages being conveyed, there's no utilitarian function here, and yet people are being incredibly moved. And this has access to our brains starting at a very young age. And I just want to illustrate that via a video that I've fallen in love with of an early response to music in life, because it shows how early this response begins. So if I can get this to work. Okay. All right, this takes about a little less than a minute.
August 6th. Is that right?
Yeah.
August 6th, 2012. Daddy's gonna play them a little song while they're eating their
guys ready?
peas.
You girls ready?
So I show that to you because that is purely abstract, that stimulus. There was no language there. Mommy and Daddy weren't saying anything to the baby. They weren't showing them pictures of real things like puppy dogs or candy. I mean, it's just non-linguistic, completely abstract tones and sounds are having that kind of effect at that age. And it carries on throughout life. It's an amazing, amazing fact that music affects us in the way that it does. And it's a fair question to ask, why does the brain respond so strongly to music? It's not the focus of my talk, but it's an active area of research. And I'll just spend one slide on this. And one suggestion is that because it activates at least 6 different pathways to emotion in our brains. This is called multiple mechanisms theory that was published in an article in Behavioral and Brain Sciences. And these authors give a list of what they think these multiple mechanisms are, including brainstem reflexes, emotional contagion from voice-like emotional sounds, and so on. It's an incomplete list, I would argue. There's things about rhythm that they don't talk about. You can see how strongly those girls were responding to the rhythm they were hearing. But I think the insight is an interesting one. There's no single pathway by which music influences emotion. There's no single emotional circuit in our brain. There are multiple emotional circuits, and for some reason, music is able to press all of those buttons in ways that is pretty unusual. Okay, so let's go on and talk about transient effects of music on the brain. And I want to do this through the lens of a study that was published in 2011 by a colleague, Stefan Kolsch, in Germany. This is effects of music listening on cortisol levels and propofol consumption during spinal anesthesia, published in Frontiers in Psychology. Now, prior studies had examined music listening's impact on stress hormones and anesthetic consumption parasurgically. But this is the first, to my knowledge, randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled study on this topic. Now, it used instrumental music. Again, tones, no verbal information. The patients are not being influenced by verbal associations with the words that they're hearing. Okay, so the design was they looked at patients having total hip joint replacement under spinal anesthesia. So this was light sedation. Patients were about 65 years old. Now, all patients were told they were going to hear relaxing sounds to mask operating theater noise. And then they were given an iPod with closed-ear headphones that was randomly chosen to either have music or a placebo, which in this case was ocean sounds, so pleasant-sounding ocean waves, crashing waves. 20 were given music, 20 were given the ocean sounds, and anesthesia was adjusted to achieve target sedation level based on the bispectral index, a measure of brain activity that anesthesiologists use to gauge how sedated a person is based on the EEG. And interestingly, all medical personnel were blinded to conditions. So they were listening over closed-ear headphones. The medical personnel had no idea if the person was listening to music or to ocean sounds and so forth. So it was really very carefully done. And this is the kind of schematic of the experiment. This bar represents, this is a timeline here, and these are the 6 time points at which they sampled cortisol, and they measured how much anesthetic was being consumed. So the music began, and then anesthesia was given, skin incision was done, and surgery began, and then the monitoring of the propofol was done there. All right, so let's look at some results. So what they basically found, let me show you these graphs. So these showing anesthesia consumption in this panel, in the control group in red and the music group in black, and anesthesia concentration, again in the control group and the music group. And the bottom line of these plots is that music listeners consumed about 15% less anesthesia in order to reach target levels of sedation based on this brain measure of bispectral index. Turning to cortisol, during surgery, this period here grayed out, music listeners had about 20% lower cortisol, which is a stress hormone indicating the activation in the HPA axis. So significant effects both in anesthesia and cortisol, raising the question of what might be the neural mechanism by which this effect is taking place. Well, the authors suggest three possibilities, which are not mutually exclusive, based on prior neural research in music. Activation of the mesolimbic dopaminergic system as one, downregulation of central nucleus of amygdala activation as two, and engagement of cognitive and attentional resources, the idea that music is kind of cognitively demanding stimulus that will require and recruit a number of neural resources for its processing. Now, it seems likely, intuitive to me, that music is more efficacious than ocean sounds in all of these respects. I think, going back to those babies, if you played them ocean sounds, I doubt they would have the response that you saw in that video. I suspect music has a stronger effect on amygdala activation, and in terms of how much attention and cognitive resources it takes to process music, again, I strongly suspect it's more than ocean sounds, given how complex music is. And interestingly, the amygdala is known to be part of the pain neuromatrix that tunes attention toward pain, along with the anterior cingulate and the insula. So the fact that it's downregulated in other studies of music and emotion suggests an interesting connection to pain processing. Now, let me briefly say something about music and the dopaminergic system, because this has been a topic of some interesting research by colleagues in Montreal at the Montreal Neurological Institute that have studied and established that musical pleasure is associated with the release of dopamine from deep brain reward areas. The most recent installment in this research used a clever design. This is a paper published this year in Science. They had listeners listen to unfamiliar music and had them scanned with fMRI. And they got an index of how much the listeners enjoyed the music by asking them, and this is the really clever part, how much of their own money they'd be willing to spend on the music they were hearing right now. Would they spend 0, 99 cents, $1.29, or $2 to purchase the song they were hearing? And this was taken as an index of how pleasurable the music was. And so they would listen to an excerpt of music, and then they would give a judgment of how much they were willing to pay for it, listen to the second excerpt while bold scanning was being done, that's fMRI scanning, and so on. And what they found was they compared activations when somebody said they wanted to purchase music versus when they said they didn't want to purchase it, sort of the two edges of the spectrum, so when they were willing to spend the most on it versus nothing. And you see activations in reward areas, in the striatum, but also, interestingly, in the insula, which is, and nucleus accumbens, sort of a reward area, but also in the insula, which was mentioned as part of the pain matrix, which is sort of interesting. And in fact, activation in the right nucleus accumbens correlated with how much people were willing to bid on the music, sort of the measure of pleasure. So the stronger activations corresponded to how much they were enjoying the music. You saw this a bit in the caudate as well. So there's indications that the system is activated by music, and this may be one of the reasons why it changes the way we perceive pain and has impacts on sedation and stress. All right, so this does lead to some idea for future research. For example, neuroimaging studies of music and pain is a wide open area. There have been behavioral studies of music showing that it abates the subjective sense of pain, but not neural studies. So one could easily imagine doing MRI studies during application of thermal stressors to look at brain systems and brain networks that are being modulated by hearing music. And it could build on behavioral experiments showing that music listening abates pain, as I mentioned. And the larger theme of this kind of research from a basic science standpoint would be the impact of descending pain modulatory systems on nociceptive input. And the theme here is that pain processing is a two-way street in the brain. It's not just sensation based on nociceptors going up to the cortex. There's also important descending modulatory inputs from some of those structures we discussed, the amygdala, the anterior cingulate, the insula, and so forth. And so it's this top-down, bottom-up interaction that leads to the subjective experience of pain. And this would be one interesting way to get at this. All right. Now I want to shift to a focus on lasting effects. So that was an example of transient effects, things that happen while the music is on. Now I want to talk about what happens after the music is off, something that lasts in your brain and affects other things that you do cognitively. So these are effects that are mediated via neuroplasticity, the capacity of the brain to change its structure and function as a result of experience. And we know now that musical training drives structural and functional changes in the brain. There's a very nice review on this in the journal Neuron by Herholtz and Zatori, published last year. But the question I want to ask today is, what impact does this have on other cognitive domains? You know, training on music is obviously going to make you a better musician, but is it going to impact other things that you do in your life, like language or attention and so forth? And language is an area of particular interest to me. And like music, language involves processing complex hierarchical sound sequences. And the study of cognitive relations between language and music is now a rather active area of research. It's an area I've been very interested in for a long time. It's the topic of a book that I published in 2008 called Music, Language, and the Brain. It's also the topic of a forthcoming MIT Press book, an edited volume edited by Michael Arbib, where they bring together scholars from across linguistics and music cognition and neuroscience and musicology to talk about these relationships and their empirical exploration. So let me just give you one example of music and neuroplasticity. This comes from a study from the Harvard Medical School in the lab of Dr. Gottfried Schlaug. And this is a study where they looked at children learning instrumental music, and they had a control condition with children who were not studying instrumental music compared to children who were. And they tracked changes in brain gray and white matter density. I think they used voxel-based morphometry. And they saw changes, I think these were roughly 8 to 9-year-olds, greater changes in certain brain regions in the music training group. So the brains were developing in both groups, but in the music group you saw faster development, more gray matter in certain areas, including the corpus callosum. They got several areas. This is just one I'm showing you. And there on the right side you can see the difference statistically measured in the volume of this part of the corpus callosum in children who are trained instrumentally versus controls, and a correlation between the volume of that area and a performance on a motor task that had to do with bimanual coordination. So there's now work showing that musical training does change the structure and function of the brain. That's just one study of several that are emerging. But as I mentioned, the question I want to ask is, can nonverbal musical training change the way the brain processes speech? Could you give a child cello lessons and expect that this is going to affect the way they hear speech and noise, or the way they process emotional vocal sounds, or their reading ability even? All these seem a little odd, and yet there seems to be some suggestive evidence that these sorts of things could happen. So, if these things could happen, how would they happen, and why would they happen? And what are the practical implications? First of all, how would this occur? How would training on a nonverbal instrument change the way your brain processes speech? Well, we know that linguistic and non-linguistic auditory processing engage widespread brain networks in both hemispheres, which overlap to some degree. So this is a slide from Josef Rauschecker, who's here in Washington, and Sophie Scott from Nature Neuroscience, showing some of the loops involved in auditory processing. It's not just the auditory cortex that processes auditory information. We see loops into the parietal lobe, premotor cortex, inferior frontal cortex. And when we image the brain, we don't see completely separate regions for linguistic and non-linguistic processing. We see some overlap. So here's just one example from a group that looked at memory for sounds, verbal versus tonal, so again, linguistic versus non-linguistic. And the red areas show areas where brain regions were activated whether you were remembering words, linguistic information, or tones, non-linguistic information. So linguistic and non-linguistic networks have some degree of overlap in the brain. Now, there's good evidence for within-domain neuroplasticity, as I've discussed briefly for music, and there's lots of evidence from language. So if linguistic and non-linguistic networks overlap, you might expect some cross-domain plasticity. That is, training in one domain actually changing the way you do processing in the other domain. All right, so if instrumental music training influences speech processing, this would have theoretical and practical implications. For example, theoretically, it would have implications for debates over what's called the modularity of language, to what extent language uses dedicated special purpose mechanisms in the brain versus mechanisms shared with other abilities. In terms of practical implications, one possible implication is preparing pre-literate brains to acquire reading. So imagine you had a child that was diagnosed in some way as being at risk for reading disorder, either because of family history or a neural test or a behavioral test. This is a young pre-reading child, say she's around 5 years old or even younger. Would training her on a musical instrument, say drums or something like that, actually impact her development of her language abilities in a way that could ameliorate some of these potential risks some of the things she's at risk for in terms of language? Now that might seem far-fetched, but there's a growing body of evidence that there are links between early rhythmic skills, nonverbal rhythmic skills, musical training, and phonological awareness, the ability to understand that words are made up of individual sounds that have to be segmented out and that can be manipulated, and that's a key step in learning how to read. This is a paper from 2012 published by, from the lab of Marianne Wolf at Tufts University, reporting these sorts of links in a correlational design with young children. All right, so can instrumental music training really influence speech processing? Now, there are many cross-sectional studies that suggest the answer is yes. So for example, at Northwestern University, Nina Kraus and her colleagues have published many studies now showing that musicians have enhanced speech perception in noise. And they're given standard speech perception and noise tests that have zero to do with music. You're listening to speech and some kind of background babble noise, and you have to say what the words were. Here are some scores. This is for children, for younger adults, and older adults showing speech perception and noise abilities for, in red for musicians and white for non-musicians. And these are musicians and non-musicians are matched for IQ and audiometric thresholds. And interestingly enough, there's a correlation between how well the musicians hear speech perception and noise and the years of musical training that they have, suggesting a role for experience-dependent plasticity as opposed to innate differences. This has been published across many journals and replicated. But of course, cross-sectional studies cannot prove causation. They are correlational. Only longitudinal experimental studies can do that. Now, longitudinal studies of instrumental music training and its impact on language are rare. There are some, and there are some that show that musical training does impact language processing. There's an experimental study by Sylvain Moreno and colleagues published in Cerebral Cortex showing impact on linguistic reading ability, even though that's not what was trained. It was music that was trained. There's an impact, there's a study in 2012 in Cerebral Cortex showing impact on fine syllable discrimination in children. So all of this suggests that music may impact what's called phonological processing, the ability to process speech sounds. But we need further longitudinal studies that use randomized controlled trials, blinded testing, and have behavioral and neural measures. And also that eliminate singing training as a possible cause of effects. Some of these earlier studies, the music training is a mix of different things, as you do with children to keep them interested. So you do some instrumental stuff, some singing. But of course, singing is a form, you could argue, is a form of language training. And perhaps it's the singing that's driving the effects. So you need to kind of take that out of the picture from a scientific perspective. It's not a value judgment about singing. It's if you want to ask if the instrumental music can change the way the brain processes speech, you have to make sure that's the only thing that the children are being exposed to in the training. All right, so assuming such effects are robust, and I'm going to take a leap of faith here because this sort of work is starting to happen more frequently, and I think it will show that instrumental music impacts speech processing, though we need more studies. There's a deeper theoretical question, which is how and why would such effects occur? Again, cellos don't sound like voices. Drums are not confused with human speech. So how is doing one going to affect the other? Well, speech and instrumental music are both certainly acoustically complex and both place significant demands on the auditory system, but they show some important differences. For example, they show opposite hemispheric biases, which is thought to reflect neural specializations. So the right hemisphere has been argued to be specialized for spectral processing and left for temporal processing by a number of researchers. And music and language drive those hemispheres separately because of the way they're structured. So again, why would musical training on an instrument impact speech processing? Now, there are a couple of proposals about why this might occur. One comes from Nina Kraus and her colleagues, and she says, we propose that music training first drives cognitive enhancements that in turn shape the nervous system's response to sound. So it's again this idea that music is changing rather complex cognitive functions that then feed back down and shape the auditory system. Here's a quote. "In the last decade, we have moved away from the classical view of hearing as a one-way street from the cochlea to higher brain centers in the cortex. It is now accepted that cognition, once thought to play no role in hearing, has a dramatic influence on hearing and subsequent communication." So what is she talking about? She's talking about the idea that auditory processing is not a one-way street. This is very reminiscent of the idea that pain processing is not a one-way street. There are both bottom-up signals from the cochlea up to the cortex, as shown in these black lines through the brainstem and the midbrain, but importantly, there are just as many descending inputs back down to the lower centers of the auditory system from higher networks, including working memory networks, attention networks, the limbic system, and so forth. And this is a slice through the brain shown where this shows where the slice is. The point is it's a very dynamic system that tunes itself. It's not a little assembly line where things are just passed upstairs and get ever more complicated. There's dynamic tuning right down to the midbrain and lower centers as well. So the framework is that music practice fine-tunes the encoding of information-bearing aspects of musical sounds, for example, pitch, that are shared with speech. Music strengthens auditory tension and working memory, and she has evidence for that. So this is more data from Nina Kraus's lab. These are standardized measures of auditory working memory, not musical just auditory working memory, in musicians and non-musicians across different age groups. Again, a correlation with years of musical experience. And they argue that cognitive attention and memory networks and sensory processing interact via reciprocal connections. All right, now there's another framework that also tries to address why you would see impacts on speech processing by training instrumental music. And that comes from Marie Besson in France at the CNRS. They argue in a paper that musicians develop an increased sensitivity to acoustical parameters for music that are shared with speech. So for example, pitch is clearly important in music and in speech. Pitch modulates in the voice as we talk. They argue that musicians have increased ability to focus attention on sounds and enhanced auditory working memory, and that increased sensitivity to these basic acoustic parameters could lead to sharper linguistic phonological representations in long-term memory. That is, your long-term kind of store of what speech sounds are like is actually sharper and more refined in musicians. So that's an interesting proposal. So I've talked to you about two proposals. What do they have in common? Well, they both argue that music training fine-tunes or increases sensitivity to acoustical features shared by speech and music. So both speech and music rely on pitch, on timing, on amplitude patterns, on, and so forth, on frequencies. So they're saying that music, for some reason, fine-tunes those over and above what speech does. And they both argue that music increases attention and working memory. But they don't really address why those things happen. You know, speech is complex too, so why would doing one complex thing help another complex thing? Are there principled reasons why this occurs? And that's what the opera hypothesis was intended to address. That's a hypothesis I proposed recently that tries to take a theoretical perspective on these effects and understand them. This is a paper published in Frontiers in Psychology called Why Would Musical Training Benefit the Neural Encoding of Speech? The Opera Hypothesis. And the idea is that music training enhances speech encoding when 5 essential conditions are met, and the first letter of those conditions gives the opera its name. So overlap in the brain networks that process some shared acoustic feature in speech and music, such as pitch. Higher precision demands in music than in speech, and that's really the conceptual core of the hypothesis. Music is placing higher demands on the nervous system than speech is for certain things that, in terms of shared auditory processing. And then emotion, repetition, and attention, as factors that promote adaptive neural plasticity. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. That comes from the animal research on plasticity. All right, so the key novel idea here is precision, that there's an asymmetry, that music in some ways is demanding more of the nervous system than speech does in terms of certain aspects of auditory processing. And yet, since speech and music share certain brain networks for auditory processing, speech benefits because of the plastic changes in those networks. So that's basically what the rest of the slide says there. This idea of higher precision is not just mine. This has also been echoed in a paper by Robert Zatorre and Sherry Baum, published in PLOS One in 2012. The idea that music makes higher precision demands. They focused on pitch in particular, as I will, but the idea is more general. All right, what was the background to opera from a neuroscience perspective? It was some remarkable findings about musicians showing enhanced midbrain neural responses to speech sounds. Now, the midbrain, really? Why would you look at the midbrain? Well, as we've talked about, the auditory system is a multi-layered, multi-level system with cortical processing, subcortical processing, midbrain processing, brainstem processing. A lot of processing happens before the cortex, unlike in vision. There's something like 8 or 9 different stations before you even hit the cortex in terms of subcortical nuclei. And you can measure quite nicely from the midbrain using non-invasive EEG responses to speech sounds. And you can study how well they reflect the actual acoustics of the sound being heard. So let's take an example. Mandarin is a language in which tones can change the meaning of a word completely. So me, the syllable me, can be spoken with 4 different tones, and that tone will change the meaning completely. Say, I'm not sure what the meanings are, but they'll be as radically different as rice and paper and mother. There'll be very different meanings. So this is an actual recording of brainstem activity in response to the syllable with tone 3. In tone 3, the pitch falls, and then it rises all over the course of about 250 milliseconds. This is from a musician and a non-musician. And just by eyeballing these, I think you can see that the musician response is stronger. It has a stronger periodic component. And actually, if you track that periodicity using autocorrelation and look at how it changes over time, it's a very faithful representation of the fundamental frequency of the speaker. In other words, that dipping pitch I just talked about. So the pitch is shown in black here, and the yellow shows the autocorrelation of this waveform. If you do that for the non-musician, you can see it's not tracking the pitch nearly as well. So this was published in Nature Neuroscience. Again, these are musicians that don't know the first thing about Mandarin, and yet their brains are tracking this syllables in this tone language more faithfully than in non-musicians. Again, there's a correlation with years of musical training in terms of how well this tracking, how good this tracking is, suggesting a role for plasticity. Now again, why look at the midbrain if you're interested in speech? Isn't speech a hugely complex cortical kind of processing problem? Yes. But the midbrain is not just a relay station. Again, remember this underlying theme I keep coming back to of interactions between higher and lower level brain centers. The brain is not a one-way street. And the midbrain seems to represent a sort of cognitive sensory hub where bottom-up information meets top-down information, and plasticity can play a role. And in fact, remember all those stations before neural signals even hit the cortex in audition? People have argued that the midbrain, in particular the inferior colliculus, has neural properties similar to sort of primary visual cortex in terms of its complexity. So we're talking about a very complex region of the brain in terms of processing. The appeal of studying this region of the brain, as shown by Dr. Krause's research, is that you have this, what's called stimulus fidelity. You can see the reflections of the actual acoustics in the signal, the neural signals, and that allows you to do things like measure those things that we looked at before, how well it reflects the signal. Experience-dependent plasticity, the fact that this neural response can change as a function of training. And this has been shown in truly experimental studies. This is from a paper where they trained non-musicians, non-Mandarin speakers to begin to process sounds of tone languages. And this is their tracking of the tone 3 of the Mandarin syllable before and after training in the same subject. So you can see that these lower level brain centers are showing experience-dependent changes in the way they respond to sound as people improve in their learning of language. All right. So now, why are these changes happening in this part of the brain? Now remember, the musicians in this study I told you about of processing Mandarin had not been trained in Mandarin. And enhancements in musician midbrain responses to speech were not just reflected to reflections of fundamental frequency, which is a cue for pitch. They also saw enhancements in reflections of timing landmarks in the syllables, syllable harmonics, and so forth. So why would musician brains encode aspects of speech with enhanced precision? I'm focusing on pitch in the further explanations, but the framework of opera is more general. So it's all about precision, the hypothesis. So let's talk about precision demands in speech. Now pitch, as I'm speaking to you and as you speak to anybody else, your pitch is not a monotone. It goes up and down in very structured ways, and that plays an important role in language. It plays a role in signaling focus, what words you're trying to emphasize, and signaling what are the boundaries of your phrases, and how you're feeling, your affect. And in tone languages, as we've discussed, pitch completely changes the meanings of words as much as vowels or consonants. So you might ask, well, okay, pitch is really important in language. How seriously is basic comprehension of speech affected if one has reduced sensitivity to pitch variation? Let's say you've got a nervous system that doesn't track the pitches of the voice so well. You know, okay, but not terrifically. And how much does that impact your ability to do the daily business of language, understanding the words in spoken sentences? Well, we've done some experiments on this, and we found that basic comprehension is robust to a lack of detail and pitch variation. We did this using Mandarin, one of these tone languages, and we just took sentences of Mandarin that had normal pitch fluctuations, and we used a computer to completely flatten those pitch fluctuations to a monotone, and we had native listeners listen to these sentences and write down what they heard. It was an intelligibility test. And as it happens, native speakers of Mandarin find the flat sentences just as intelligible as the ones with naturally varying fundamental frequency, suggesting that if you had a nervous system that didn't track those pitch variations so well, you would probably be okay. You'd find a way to understand what was being said. This is what's called robustness. There are many redundant cues to phonetic features in language, and there are also lots of semantic and syntactic constraints in language that help us understand what somebody is saying. What this suggests at a broader level is that speech perception tolerates a wide range of pitch and coding quality. If you don't track pitch so well, you'll probably be able to still do speech reasonably well. This is actually even shown by people with cochlear implants, which can understand speech, but cochlear implants don't convey pitch information very well. Well, what about music? Well, obviously pitch is important in music. It's the basis of melody, and small changes, for example, the difference between a C and a C sharp can make a huge difference perceptually if you go out of key. That's just a 6% change in pitch. And you can ask, okay, again, how seriously is basic comprehension music affected if one has little sensitivity to pitch variation? And now you're in a different ballpark, because now if you can't follow the nuances of pitch, it's a problem. And this is, in fact, one of the problems behind musical tone deafness, true musical tone deafness, where people can't tell melodies apart, they can't recognize what should be highly familiar melodies in their own culture, and so forth. Lots of work by Isabelle Peretz and colleagues on this in Montreal. So music perception demands fairly accurate pitch encoding. In other words, music places higher demands on pitch encoding than speech does, I would argue. And this sets the stage for musical training to enhance pitch processing in the brain over and above what speech is needed for speech. But since speech and music share pitch encoding networks, speech benefits. You might say that's all fine, but are there any real-world consequences? So if you don't need such terrific precision for tracking pitch in speech, why would it be so good for your speech perception to have such things? Well, let's go back to that experiment with Mandarin. Remember, we flattened the pitch of Mandarin sentences, making them monotone. These were news-like utterances, like the local train left the station an hour ago, so full, semantically, syntactically coherent sentences. And we found in quiet that they were just as intelligible as sentences that had intact fundamental frequency contours. That's shown in this graph, natural F0 and flat F0, and that's the intelligibility score. But if you embed the speech in background noise, so this is background babble noise, which you'd hear at a cocktail party in Beijing, that's when it hits and it hurts. That's when having no F0 modulations really lowers your ability to perceive the words. So for example, at 0 dB SNR, that is when the speech is just as loud as the background noise, you're 20% worse at understanding the words in Mandarin sentences if there's no pitch variation. Okay? So that's where being able to track pitch accurately does seem to help you hear speech in noise. And it's known that pitch variation helps people pull voices out of noise. So there's a real-world consequence to better tracking of speech pitch, I would argue. All right, we studied F0 in this study, but I think that we've gotten similar results if we played around with other acoustic aspects of speech, because speech is a very robust system. And natural sentence perception involves the integration of many acoustic cues to phonetic features with lots of redundancy between them. Also predictive listening. We predict what's coming up next. We're not passive listeners. So what all this boils down to is that speech is a robust communication system in quiet settings. So if any relatively coarse perception of any individual cue, such as pitch or perhaps timing, is tolerable because of many redundancies in the way the cues map onto phonetic features. So for example, there was a paper published in '86 saying, what do people use to tell rapid as in fast from rabid as in a rabid dog? Now those are very similar words. They're kind of hard to tell apart in some respect. It's what's called a voicing distinction. There's a voice onset time cue. It is often talked about as the primary cue. But there's actually many different cues. There's fundamental frequency, vowel duration. The point of this paper was that there are several cues that converge to help us understand distinctions between words. Whoops, excuse me. If you're not so sensitive to one cue, you might be more sensitive to another and be able to understand speech. So more recently, I've been expanding this framework, the opera framework. First of all, beyond pitch, because music demands high precision in other aspects of auditory processing, not just pitch. For example, timing. In music, timing is really important, and getting the timing right is really important for ensemble playing, for communicating emotion, and so forth. And this may underlie these links that people are discovering between early rhythmic skills and phonological processing in language, and leads to ideas, as I mentioned, about using early rhythmic training to change the way the brain processes speech sound in young children, particularly children that might be at risk for reading disorders. And also going beyond precision, music makes higher demands, I would argue, on auditory working memory. When we listen to language, we listen for meaning. It's very rare that if somebody stops, in the middle of a conversation and asks you to repeat what they just said, that you will be able to do that in a word-for-word way. You'll give them the gist of what they just said, but forget it. Trying to say what they just said in a word-for-word way, even the very last sentence they said, very unlikely, because we're just constantly going into the domain of meaning. That doesn't work in music. If your teacher says, play it this way, and then plays a little passage on the drums or on the cello, you can't just extract the gist and forget about the details. You have to remember the details, because that's what you're trying to reproduce. So there's high working memory demands in music. You have to maintain chunks of sound in your head in ways that you don't for speech. So I would argue that also plays a role, the higher demands for working memory. All right, let's talk briefly about emotion, repetition, and tension in opera, the ERA of opera. So music training links all this really demanding high-precision auditory processing to things that are positive emotionally, that require a lot of repetition. You practice and practice in music until you get it right, and you focus. It's focused attention. You have to focus on what you're doing in music to learn music. And these all just come straight from the animal literature in terms of things that help drive neuroplasticity. You look at the work of Michael Merznick, you look at the work of many other people that have done many, many experiments. You want to get an animal to learn something and change its neural representation of that thing in the brain. You get them involved with reward. You reward the animal, you activate the emotion systems that releases dopamine release. You do mass training, so you get the animal to repeat it over and over again. You make the animal pay attention. That will result in release of acetylcholine from the nucleus basalis and so forth. Music has all those in spades. And so it just meshes perfectly with what we know about how the brain learns in terms of the animal research, in terms of driving plasticity. All right, so the expanded opera framework basically argues that instrumental music training enhances speech processing because there are overlapping brain networks for processing shared acoustic features in speech and music, such as pitch and timing. Music places higher demands on precision of encoding on certain auditory features and on auditory working memory. And music involves emotion, repetition, and attention in spades. And this activates neuroplasticity. So this leads to ideas for experimental studies that I'm hoping to pursue. I want to tell you briefly about a couple of lines of research that I'm involved in that are related to this. One is a young collaboration between the UCSD, a study called PLING, Tufts University, and the San Diego Youth Symphony and Conservatory. And this addresses a new area of research about how the arts impact human development. This is an area of growing research in our society. There was a white paper published in 2011 that was joint between the National Endowment for the Arts and the Department of Health and Human Services, called the Arts and Human Development, which recommended the formation of a new federal intertask agency to promote research on the arts and human development, including cooperation between the NEA and the NIH. The goal was to disseminate information and frame a national research agenda on how this arts and development are related. So this white paper identified some research gaps in the existing literature, including a dearth of longitudinal studies, which we know are key for inferring a causal role of music training on brain and behavioral changes. There's also a need for properly controlled studies and for addressing how brain changes are related to cognitive changes. So you want to do both behavioral and neural measures and relate them in very precise ways. So one thing we've tried to do to get this line of research started is start a program called SIMPHONY. Now that's an acronym as well. It stands for Studying the Influence of Music Practice Has on Neurodevelopment in Youth. This was started in July of 2012. Here's a couple of the key players: Dr. John Everson from UCSD, the Institute for Neural Computation, and DeLuke Smith, the president and CEO of the San Diego Youth Symphony. It's building on a wonderful research project called PLING, which itself was started in 2011, has nothing to do with music. This is called Pediatric Longitudinal Imaging Neurocognition and Genetics. This is has a behavioral core of testing with an extensive database and administration being handled by Terry Jernigan at UCSD. So it has extensive cognitive tests that are administered to children. There's a very strong imaging core led by Dr. Anders Dale out of UCSD, which is using state-of-the-art imaging of neural fiber tracts. It's got a 5-year duration, with children start between 5 and 8 years old and are imaged once a year for 5 years and tested cognitively once a year for 5 years. It's an NIH-funded study. But it's not explicitly designed to control for different types of experience. They're just following how the brain develops over 5 years in these children. They really weren't concerned about are the children doing music or art or sports or anything. It was just taking kids as they come and studying neurocognition and genetics. It's a really unusual study in that respect in terms of how dense the sampling of brain and behavior is and the state-of-the-art imaging. So it examines brain structure and brain connections, so gray and white matter concentrations in different regions of the brain, but also imaging fiber tracts using new techniques called diffusion tensor imaging that allow one to kind of image fiber tracts in the brain based on the diffusion of water along fiber tracts. So it allows you to see these incredibly rich connections that we have between different brain regions that connect the front and back of the brain, side to side, local connections, distant connections, and image them over time as the brain develops. So this project, PLING, can quantify neurodevelopmental trajectories. So for example, in this slide, you can see 3 parts of the corpus callosum, the genu, the body, and the splenium, in red, blue, and green. And this is showing fractional anisotropy, which is a measure of the organization of these fiber tracts and how it changes over age. And so you get these developmental trajectories, which is very nice, because then what we can do is kind of build on that and see how different types of experience influence brain development, and in particular music is the one we're interested in. This project got off the ground because we were able to cooperate and collaborate with the San Diego Youth Symphony, which has a community opus project. This is based on the El Sistema method of education, which brings free music education to low SES and underserved areas. So they give them intensive, no-cost orchestral musical training. And there was a first-year pilot, which has now been expanded to 6 schools and 250 students in Chula Vista, California. And it's a program that's been shown in different parts of the world to have strong social and educational impacts. So to give you an overview of how we're planning to run this study, there are 3 groups: a music training group, kids enrolled in the symphony; an active control, they're studying martial arts, so getting some other form of stimulating but non-musical education outside of school; and a passive control that's not doing an extra activity. And we're going to be testing them once a year for 5 years with 6 hours of behavioral and cognitive testing per year. So a lot of cognitive tests having to do with language, executive function, attention, and so forth, also music perception. And then importantly, these MRI tests of gray and white matter structure and of fiber tract imaging. And finally, EEG midbrain, speech processing in the midbrain related to those studies I told you about from Dr. Nina Kraus. We're going to apply that technique to study development of responses to speech in these children. So what we want to examine is how music training impacts development of language, executive function, attention, and so forth. This is hypothesis-driven research based on the opera hypothesis and other work in the literature about how music impacts other brain functions. And the study really is sort of unusual in terms of the breadth and depth of processing, being able to follow kids over 5 years and image them every year for 5 years. So we've just gotten this off the ground and we're very excited about it. The next step in this kind of research is to do more controlled lab studies. The SIMPHONY study is great, but it is in the real world, it's in the environment, and there's certain things you can't control. So I would like to do further experimental, longitudinal, and randomized controlled studies with very tight control over the type of training, because I suspect the type of instrument you learn, the way you learn it is going to influence which benefits you get in language. And I'd like to have tight control over that and measure progress quantitatively in those training regimens. And I'd like to work with young children, pre-reading children in fact, to address this issue of whether or not you can change the course of their phonological language development by using instrumental music. So testing specific hypotheses about how instrumental training impacts language processing. And this does have a couple of translational goals. One is boosting phonological development, that is the processing of speech sounds in children at risk for reading disorders. So getting to them early before they start to actually read in the classroom and seeing if you can change their trajectory by instrumental musical training. And second, exploring the specific benefits of using music to influence language development. Because if you step back, you might think, well, why would you really ever go to music? If you think the kid's going to have a phonological processing problem, why don't you just train them on phonology? And that's kind of what we do now. It's brute force training of phonology. We do lots of exercises with rhymes and words and games, and that's all great. But music may have some advantages over those sorts of intensive language-based training, especially for young children. The level of emotional engagement it elicits, you remember the girls and how excited they were about the music. If you want to activate plasticity in the brain, getting high levels of emotional engagement and attention is certainly something you want to do. From a scientific standpoint, if you're interested in processing of specific acoustic features like pitch or timing, in music, you can really isolate those and just focus the child's mind on those things. In speech, there's always 100 things changing at once. A syllable is many, many different features all packaged together. So you may be trying to change pitch, but there's also changing amplitude and duration and meaning and all these things that consume resources in terms of processing. So I'd like to know if actually music, I don't think it'll ever be a replacement for actual language training for children at risk with reading disorders, but I think it might be a very beneficial addition and might do certain things over and above what you can achieve with language or may interact synergistically with it. All right, so just to conclude, the impact of music on brain function is now increasingly a topic for basic scientific research. So we've come a long way since Plato's speculations, but it's really only the past decade that this has kind of taken off as a research area. And there's an emphasis in this area on the manner in which music impacts other brain functions. So that's really a key point. I think many of us who are studying music in the brain are interested in the broader cognitive and neural implications for human cognition. This has theoretical implications for how the mind works, whether it's divided into these highly specialized compartments or whether things really are much more interactive in terms of cognition, and practical implications for health, education, and neural development. And with that, I will close, and thank you for your attention.
Ani, that was terrific. I'm sure there will be questions or comments from the audience. I'll start. So these children you have who are learning instruments in the San Diego Symphony, one of the interesting things about music learning is that many people stick with it and some don't. And I wonder if you have any hypotheses about different neural structures and how that may
Yes.
determine that and whether that's something you're going to be able to look at.
That's a really good question. As Dr. Briggs pointed out, there are a lot of people that take music lessons and then give it up. And there's
Probably a lot in the room.
yes,
I'm
maybe,
one,
maybe
so.
many of you here in the room. And the question is, does this have any impact, lasting impact on the brain, and if so, what structures are involved? In fact, I'm really glad you asked that question because a paper just came out in Journal of Neuroscience either late last year or early this year addressing exactly this question. And it was from Dr. Krause's lab looking at precisely the kinds of people you're talking about. They studied music as kids, and these were now college students that had long given it up. And they looked at their brainstem responses to speech sounds, midbrain responses to speech sounds versus those of non-musicians. And there was still a difference between them, suggesting that there were residual effects on how sharply the brain encodes speech. Now that would suggest, areas in the brain involved in attention and working memory having influences on midbrain structures, if you want to think about anatomical location. But it's just a first step. Certainly I expect that the really strong effects of music will be reflected in people that are actively doing music.
The more the better.
Yeah, yeah, just as in almost any other branch of neuroplasticity. Yeah.
Go ahead. I'm wondering if this effect might become more complex or even break down at some point in disordered populations. Like, for example, with children with autism or individuals with autism, they might have an increased ability to enhanced ability to perceive pitch.
Yes.
Yet, and it seems like it would be silly to even try to enhance this more because it doesn't help them with the with perception of affect.
Right. So yes, anytime you're dealing with a complex thing like autism, there are many, many components, right? And so the fact that one component is working well doesn't mean that the whole system is going to work better, right? So there's theory of mind issues, mentalizing issues with autism that need to be treated completely separately from their auditory processing issues. So yes, I'm pretty much thinking, the way I cast this was more in terms of neurotypical or people at risk for reading disorders that don't have serious socio-psychological other issues that might interfere with their learning. Yeah.
Go ahead.
This would be impossible to do right now in a longitudinal way, but is there any association been made between the incidence of dementia and people who have or have not had musical training or appreciate music or do not, or listen to music or do not?
That's an excellent question. There's a lot of interest in that because of the rising incidence of Alzheimer's. So is music one of the things that can be neuroprotective in some ways, in terms of if you engage in it, does it? And I remember, I wish I could quote you the source, but I do remember reading secondhand about sort of epidemiological studies showing that those engaged with music statistically show a later onset of dementia. But that may be comparable to others engaged in other, cognitively demanding tasks.
Other comments or questions? Go ahead.
Does in utero exposure to musical stimuli affect neural development?
Does in utero exposure to musical stimuli affect neural development? A fantastic question. We know that from scientific studies that babies will recognize at birth songs they've heard in utero. There are some fantastic experiments showing that if a woman is asked to listen to a particular song, it's not even her singing, it's a song she hears from a speaker across the room daily during pregnancy, and it really only matters in the third trimester when the fetus can hear, that at birth the infant will orient to that song versus to another song. And there's actually more recently prenatal MEG recordings of auditory responses from babies in utero. So, the brain is developing so rapidly around the time of birth. And if you think of musical stimulation as a kind of auditory enrichment and all the work that's been done on enriched environments and how that changes the synaptic kind of structure and connectivity of the brain, it's certainly a plausible hypothesis that early music exposure would have an impact on neural development, but nobody has looked at that quantitatively. It's a great idea.
Does learning music pre-associate people to learn foreign languages better? And with those foreign languages, be able to learn foreign languages total better than language stuff?
Yeah, does learning music predispose you to learning foreign languages better? There are correlational studies showing that people with more musical aptitude are better at picking up the sounds of foreign languages. So not necessarily the grammar, but speaking with a better accent, essentially, hearing the subtle distinctions and producing them yourself, which is something that gets harder as we get older. And then whether it would give you a particular leg up on tonal languages is a great question, certainly intuitively plausible. I think there is some work being done on that by Patrick Wong in Hong Kong, but I don't yet know the results. Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
I'm sorry, are there studies on different
Different genres, jazz versus classical?
in terms of how it affects the brain? Not that I'm aware of. There's social psychology research on different genres of music and how it reflects one's identity and personality. But I think underneath your question is a very interesting point about, we talk about musical training and its impact on the brain, but of course, what musical training is and the demands it puts on your brain is very different if you're learning one instrument versus another. If you're learning drums, a lot of emphasis on precise rhythm, not so much on pitch. If you're learning violin, perhaps the opposite. So I think those things need to be taken into account in terms of what our predictions are, in terms of what aspects of speech processing or other domains are going to be impacted. Yeah.
Well, Dr. Patel is going to be with us for a good part of the day today, and so there'll be other opportunities to continue this very interesting conversation. Thank you so much. That
Thank
was
you.
great.
Thank you.